Man, I love that song. What a prayer. I pray that it was more than just words on a screen or sounds that came out of your mouth. I pray that that springs from your heart. God, knowing you is my heart's cry. My heart's cry. Well, we've been in this series, Family Matters, and we've tackled some tough topics. Last week was a tough topic on divorce, but we're going to hit one this morning that hits all of us, I think. One way or the other, trauma has come, and you know, trauma looks like a different in different areas, and truthfully, 25 to 30 minutes is not going to do it justice, and so we're going to basically just hit the top and hit the surface and scratch it, but maybe we can glean some truths that will help us in the journey, help us in the middle of the trauma. You know, on one end of trauma, you'd have maybe something like just like family tension. And family tension can be mild or family tension can be major. And you know that when you have things like Thanksgiving comes around and Christmas comes around and you just are saying, please don't bring up this topic. Let's stay away from this. Let's just kind of smile and make things okay for the time being. You know, tension's in the room. And so you can have that, and it changes family dynamics, and it can bring ulcers to you and worry and anxiety. And so you have that on one end, and then you maybe can ratchet it up a little bit and more, and you maybe have a prodigal, and you have a prodigal son or a prodigal daughter, a prodigal child, and they've wandered away, and your heart hurts, and you've cried out to God, and you've prayed to God for that prodigal to come home, and maybe you're a son or daughter and you're looking at a mom or a dad that's prodigal, and because they can be prodigals too, and you're hurting for them and you're crying out for them, and you have this prodigal issue, and then you have trauma in which something's hit your marriage or hit your family and hit your life, and it's turned it upside down and you didn't know it was coming. It could be something from childhood, or it could be a sickness that has been diagnosed. It could be a sudden loss of a loved one, but the storms hit, the waves are crashing in, and you're in the middle of trauma, and the boat seems to be sinking, and you're wondering, how am I going to walk through this? How am I going to get through this trauma? And it hits all families. I'm convinced of this, that families that make it look like they have their act together, if you got to see behind the veneer, the smile on the face, you're going to see some trauma, some hurt, some wounds that are either old or new and fresh, but every family walks through this. And the question is, how do we walk through it in a way where we can come out on the other side not totally destroyed? You know, one of the things I love about the Scriptures is it doesn't hide anything from it. It gives us the ugly. It gives us the things that just aren't pretty. I mean, just think about Jacob. So Jacob had 12 sons. And one of the sons was Joseph. And Jacob's favorite son was Joseph. And Joseph knew about it. But so did Joseph's brothers. Now, let me just ask you, do you think there was tension in that family? Joseph got the coat of many colors. What did the other 11 brothers get? Not that. And then Joseph had a dream. And in the dream, the interpretation of the dream was that all of the brothers and even the father and the family, they were going to bow down to him one day. That's a dream you keep to yourself, Joseph. Oh no, what does Joseph do? Joseph runs to the brothers and say, hey, I had a dream. Let me tell you about it. There's coming a day you're going to bow down to me. You talk about tension? Trauma just hit. So much so, they sold their brother to a caravan, and they came back and told their dad, he died. An animal got him. What about Isaac and Ishmael? They're half brothers. The only problem was Isaac was chosen and Ishmael's not. That brought some tension probably. We read that Ishmael was mocking Isaac. So much so that Sarah told Abraham, the father of both of them, said, I want you to send Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, I want you to send them away. Why? There was tension in the room. Think about Eli. Eli was a preacher. Eli was a priest. The only problem was Eli's two sons were wicked. I mean, like really wicked. How that had to just tear Eli up. A messenger for God and a spokesperson for God, yet his sons were running from God and doing wicked things. Or David and his son Absalom. Absalom was rebelling against his father. And David had to navigate those waters where a son was rebelling, and it hurt David. It was tearing him apart. He had an adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, and the baby was born, and then 8 days later the baby died. A newborn. Dead. And then Absalom, later his son, was murdered. I mean, how much pain could one endure navigating the waters of trauma that hit the family? Or Job. Job was a righteous man. I mean, he followed God. He worshiped God. He served God. And his whole family died. His sons, his daughters, all of his children passed away. He lost his health. He didn't lose his wife, but his wife kept on nagging him. He didn't lose his friends, but his friends weren't really supportive in the moment. In fact, there were moments I'm sure Job would have said to God, I can lose them too if you really want to take them. See, when you look at the scriptures, here's what you find. You find the good, but you find the bad, you find the ugly. And you find families that are ripped apart. You find families that have to deal with tension. You find families where the prodigals are in there. You find families where trauma's come, where death has come, where destruction has come, where the boat seems to be going down and waves seem to be hitting and winds seem to be howling. You find all of it right here. And what you find is that there's a God who's bigger than the storm. You find a God who will walk with you in the midst of the trauma. With you to the other side. But what I want to do this morning is I want to use the disciples as our model here. I want to use the disciples. They'd spent 3 years together. You would probably consider them, could count that they would be family. They spent more hours together than they probably had apart. And what you find in the family of the apostles and the family of the disciples is you find trauma has hit. You find tension that is real. You find prodigals in this group. So I want to look at the disciples. They had tension, by the way. They had tension not just because they were 12 guys in a group that spent the better part of 3 years together. You had tension because you had two guys, James and John. They were brothers. They went to Jesus and said, Jesus, hey, can we be number 1 and number 2 in heaven? And the other 10 found out. And we know that the other 10 was upset because they didn't think of it first. Tension. But I want to tell you, I know that they had tension because there were 2 of the apostles. There was Matthew and there was Simon the Zealot. And I guarantee you, just because those 2 were on the team, there was tension. Matthew's a tax collector. Now, Matthew, being a tax collector, was not a favorite among the Jewish people. They considered tax collectors traitors, and they would steal from their own people. That's what tax collectors did. And so Matthew was one of these guys, and Jesus asked Matthew to be on the team. That brought tension just among the other team members. But then he asked Simon the Zealot to be on the team as well. Well, Simon the Zealot's crucial here. And zealots were basically modern day terrorists. Can you believe that? Jesus asked a modern day terrorist to be on the team. Zealots hated traitors of the people. I mean, they were zealous for the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, and if anything was to bring the Jewish people down, they were against it. They would fight against it. They had this knife that they used called a Sakari knife. It was a curved dagger, and they would go up behind people that were not helping the Jewish cause, and they would stick this dagger in the back of their enemy and twist it and kill the person. I mean, they were modern day terrorists. Well, Matthew's a traitor. And Simon the Zealot hated traitors and killed traitors. And they're on the same team. Can you imagine some of their conversations? Can you imagine some of their tension? Can you imagine Matthew sleeping with an eye open? I mean, I would. I wouldn't trust Simon the Zealot as far as I could throw him. Literally, you could cut the tension, with a knife. Tension. And somehow Jesus was able to lead this team in unity. I want to share with you 3 words that I believe helps in the area where there's tension, and if there's tension in the family, and I think these 3 words help navigate that. And we see these in Jesus. First, grace. Word number 1 is grace. Jesus lived his life full of grace. In fact, John tells us in John chapter 1, Jesus was full of grace and full of truth. He never minimized the truth. He never compromised the truth, but he was always full of grace. And the disciples needed that grace often. Because the apostles were just less than perfect. And that's what happens. And that's what you need when you have less than perfect people in the mix. Grace. And my guess is where there's tension in the family, there's less than perfect people there. Not you, but the other people in the family is less than perfect. Grace is always a great thing to put into the situation where there's people. Always. Whether it's in the family or outside of the family, if you start living life full of grace, extending grace, dispensing grace, and there's people around, it can't be a bad thing. See, we need to go around being grace dispensers, grace extenders, extending grace in situations where people are there. Jesus did all the time. Grace. Second word is peacemaker. Jesus not only lived his life this way, but he taught his followers to live life this way, to be a peacemaker. In the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitude, Matthew chapter 5, it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Blessed are those who are going around building peace instead of stirring up strife. Can I tell you, just looking at our society, we have very few peacemakers and a whole lot of pot stirrers. But where there's tension, being a peacemaker is always a positive thing. Romans chapter 12, verse 18, Paul says it this way. Paul says, if it's possible, as far as it depends upon you, live at peace with everyone. So yes, there are going to be times where it's not possible. There are going to be times where that is not a possibility. But when it's possible, you be the one who is going to live life making peace, live life bringing peace. See, here's one of the facts that peacemakers have about them is they don't always have to be right. And one of the areas which causes a lot of tension and stirs a lot of anguish and anxiety and is this feeling that we've got to be right. And we demand our rights. And peacemaker understands there are times where I don't have to be right. But notice Paul says if it's possible, because there are times where it's not. But as far as it depends upon you, if it's possible, live at peace. Peacemaker. So grace, peacemaker, here's the third word, love. Love. I struggled with this word because I thought of some other words to put in there, but love covers it all. Jesus said, by the way, love one another. How many times did Jesus say that? To his apostles, love your enemies, he said to his apostles. Love those who persecute you, he said. Love. But we need to know what this looks like. We need to have a picture of what this love actually looks like in the context where people are present. And so two passages, one's not on the screen, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, here's the definition of love. Here's the way love is fleshed out. Love is patient. By the way, patience will help. In the midst of tension, patient. Love is kind. That will help. Love does not envy. Love is not boastful. It is not arrogant. It is not rude or self-seeking. It is not irritable. All those would help in areas where there's tension. Does not keep a record of wrong. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. But then Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 5, this fruit of the Spirit. And this fruit of the Spirit is to be characteristic of Jesus' followers. He says, man, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, and patience, and kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You put those qualities in contexts where there's people, in families where there's tension, I just believe you'll be able to navigate life in tension better. So 3 words. We see them, I think, in the life of Jesus. We see them in the operation of the disciples: grace, peacemaker, and love. What about the prodigal? Where there's a son or a daughter that's just rebelled, has left. There's a relationship that is strained. At the minimum, cut off completely at the maximum. You know, the apostles, they experienced this too. That Jesus was leading a team where there was some prodigals. Judas is the one that comes up immediately. Judas betrayed Jesus, sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. Peter's another one that you could come up with. Peter denied Jesus 3 times in the courtyard when Jesus was being put on trial and was asked, hey, do you know this man? No, I don't know him. Jesus had a betrayer. Jesus had a denier. But let's just not let the other ones off the hook either, because in the garden, all of them fled. How do you respond with the prodigal? I would say first, there's no guarantees. We see that with Judas, do we not? Judas never returned. Judas never came back to the team. Judas made the decision that it was a done thing. It was a done deal. There was no recourse for reconciliation. I'm done. I'm gone. And he committed suicide. He hung himself. But knowing Jesus, I convinced he would have received him back if Judas came back with repentance. My Lance, he forgave the thief on the cross, who lived his whole life in wickedness and rebellion, deserving the death. And in the last minute, before he died, Jesus said, I'll receive you in paradise. See, I believe Jesus was there with open arms, waiting for Judas to return, but Judas never did return. But what about Peter? Peter thought that he was done as well. Peter thought that he was never going to be allowed to come back, that he had burned the bridges and that things were. In fact, he was fishing. He went back to his occupation before he became a follower, and he's on the sea, he's fishing, and all of a sudden Jesus is on the shore building a fire. And Peter recognizes Jesus on the shore. So what does Peter do? He jumps in the water. They just caught a great number of fish, by the way, and he says, well, you can bring the fish in. I'm going to swim to the shore. And Peter swam to the shore to see Jesus. And what we find is Jesus on the shore welcoming Peter, who came back. Understand, Jesus was on the shore, but Peter had to make the decision to come. So you can't force a prodigal to come home. You can pray for them, and do. And you can communicate love, and you can communicate forgiveness, and you can communicate, we'll welcome you back home, but the prodigal has to make the decision to come home. We know the story of Luke chapter 15. We have the prodigal son. The youngest son came to his father and said, I want my inheritance. In essence, he was saying, Dad, I wish you were dead because I want my inheritance now. And so his father gave him his inheritance. He left and went to the far country, and he wasted it, squandered it with wild living. And he's in the far country, the prodigal is, and the father is at home. But what's the father doing? Every day he's looking in the distance, longing to see his son come home. Hoping to see his son in the horizon coming home. Now, there's a son who had to make the decision to come up, to get back up and go back home. But what do we see of the father when he sees the son in the distance? He runs to him. Now, in Jesus' day, running was not honorable, respectable for a man. But the father threw all that out the window when he saw the prodigal coming home. So Jesus is on the shore, and Peter jumps in the water. He swims to the shore, and there's a fire on the shore. Interesting, we're told that it's a charcoal fire. It's just a small detail. Except when you find out that the fire that Peter was around in the courtyard when he denied Jesus was also a charcoal fire. I'm sure when Peter got out of the water and walked up to the fire and where Jesus was, I'm sure Peter realized the similarities between the two fires. One, he denied him. And now he's at the fire in which Jesus is welcoming him back. Jesus asked him 3 questions. This is John chapter 21. Peter, do you love me? Peter responded, you know I love you. Peter, do you love me? You know I love you. 3 times. Peter, do you love me? 3 times Peter denied him. 3 times Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? 3 times Peter said, yes. And Jesus said, welcome home. With the prodigal, it's hard because with the prodigal, there's no guarantee. You pray, you love, you forgive. You're ready to welcome him home. And when you see him in the distance, you run to him. It also means, though, that it doesn't mean that things are going to go back to normal. I'm not going to say that. There might be some parameters that have to be set up. There might be some things that need to be done. But a relationship restored is what God desires. So what about trauma? It can look like a lot of things. It could have started in childhood. Maybe there was an alcoholic father. Maybe there was an absentee father. Maybe there was abuse. Verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. But the scars are still there. Maybe there was even sexual abuse that you endured as a child. Maybe in the home, but maybe it was from an uncle, maybe it was from a family member outside of your immediate family, but it's there. Here's what I have just come to expect through the years of talking with folks and observations is there's probably someone here this morning who's experienced sexual abuse as a kid. And the wounds that go with that's huge. It could be that something has happened unexpected. Maybe it's a diagnosis of an illness. Maybe it's the losing of a loved one. Maybe it was sudden. and the world is turned upside down and the boat seems to be sinking and you're in the midst of the trauma. And some of you are saying, I don't know if I can make it. The disciples, they encountered trauma, by the way. Their leader was arrested, Jesus, and was put on trial, was condemned to death by crucifixion and was crucified and died. Their leader, the one that they had put their hopes in, the one that they said was the Messiah, the Messiah who was going to come and restore Israel as they expected him to, and now he's on the cross, and the Messiahs don't die, and so they were questioning a lot of things, and they were wondering, what did we do? Did we give up the last 3 years of our life for this? Their lives had been turned upside down, and they were walking in darkness alone. Jesus, he experienced trauma. In the garden, he's praying to his Father, and there's sweat drops of blood. That's the anguish. He was arrested, falsely accused. He was put on trial, and not real trials. They just wanted to appease the folks so they could get a death sentence. And then he was beaten, and he was humiliated and disrespected and spat upon. And then he was nailed to a tree, and he was hanging there. Trauma. How in a short time, everything for the life of the disciples and even for the life of Jesus was turned upside down. I think it's important for us to realize that Jesus endured injustice, and Jesus endured heartache, and Jesus endured suffering. Jesus endured many wounds and scars. We can all see them on the cross. And I think it's important for us to realize that, because when you're in the midst of the trauma, here's what I want you to hear. Jesus is with you in the trauma. God is with you. You've never been asked to walk the trauma by yourself. Although it seems like there might be no one with you, that God has abandoned you, that God has left you. We read in Psalm chapter 23, God, how long are you going to stay silent? How long are you going to hide your face from me? How long are you going to seem distant to me? And so we know that it seems like God is distant, and it seems like God might be far from you, that he's abandoned you. But I just want you to hear, God's with you in the storm. The Great Commission, Matthew chapter 28, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. And that's not a small consolation prize that God is with you, because God being with you means that God is your helper. God is your refuge. And in the middle of a storm, there's nothing better you need than a refuge and a helper. God is your stronghold. God is your strength. God is your provider. God brings you comfort. God is your defender. God is your advocate. God is your Savior. God is. And so in the midst of the storm, what a comforting reminder it is to us that in the midst of it, God is with you. And I would say that if you're in a trauma, if you're going through a storm, if you're going through a rough time, that the tendency for us is to run from God. It's just a natural default for us to run from God. There's anger usually, there's some questions, there's doubts, many times there's bitterness, and sometimes that's directed toward God, and so there's a running from God. But in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the trauma, we run to God. And sometimes it just has to rely on trust in God. I love what the psalmist said in Psalm 13 after he says, how long, O God, how long, O God, how long, O God? He ends it by saying, but I trust in your unfaithful love. The Hebrew word is hesed, amazing word. I trust in your unfaithful love. I trust you. So I don't know where you are. Maybe you're in the middle of trauma. Maybe you're in the middle of tension. Maybe you're in the middle of your life being turned upside down. And if you are there, I just want you to hear God's with you. And what he brings to the situation is enough. Because God is, and you can fill in the blank, God is your refuge. God is your strength, your hope, your help, your comfort, your defender, your provider. God is there. If you're not in a situation right now where there's trauma, just hold on, because it's coming. And when it hits, you hang on to God, because he's with you there. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, when the trauma hits and my life is turned upside down, I won't fear, because God is with you in the valley. Father, we thank you that you are a God who comforts and you are a God who is present. You're a God who is with us. And family's hard. And family's tough. And sometimes family's ugly. It brings hurt and wounds and scars and questions and doubts and anger. Father, this morning, would you just remind us that you are God? And you're bigger than the storm. You're bigger than the hurt. And you're enough. So, Father, I pray that we would rest in your love today. That we would feel your love today. That you would wrap us around with your love and your comfort and your strength. And we thank you that you don't make us walk this alone and do this alone, that you're in the valley with us. You're in the boat with us. You're in this thing called life with us. And so we say thanks. Father, these next few moments, would you just move in this place and encourage us, comfort us. You know where we are. You know our hurts and our wounds, and you know our questions, our doubts. For some, you know the anger that's there. Would you just meet us right where we are? Speak into us a word of hope today. It's in Christ's name I pray.